In 10 minutes here on 2 in tonight's edition of Newsnight, all the latest on the battle for the Conservative Party leadership. Mrs Thatcher is trying tonight to reassert control of her divided party, but are the votes slipping away? That's Newsnight at 10:30. But first, Professor David Cannadine offers a personal and historical perspective on Mrs Thatcher in Fifth Column.
David Cannadine is a British historian who now teaches in New York at Columbia University. He writes about the structure of British society, most recently the decline of the aristocracy. After yesterday's inconclusive first ballot amongst Conservative members of Parliament for the leadership of their party, and thus the job of Prime Minister, Mrs Thatcher's political survival is in the balance. Professor Cannadine takes a long view of her 11 years as Prime Minister. He believes that in a historical context, she will be seen to have been neither as novel nor as remarkable as she is perceived today.
A friend of mine has a son who is 13 years old. One day recently, he asked his father a simple but rather devastating question. "Daddy," he inquired, "are men ever Prime Ministers of this country?" Since Mrs Thatcher has been at 10 Downing Street more than 11 years, it's understandable that he should have been feeling anxieties on this score. For all people of his age, and for many a good deal older, politics before Thatcher simply didn't exist. She may be Prime Minister today, but unlike most of her predecessors this century, she has already become part of history, even as she continues to make it. There's no denying Mrs Thatcher's extraordinary political success. 11 unbroken years in power and 3 consecutive victories at general elections put her far ahead of such textbook titans as Peel, Palmerston, Gladstone, Salisbury, Asquith and Winston Churchill. Not until we reach back to the pale and shadowy figure of Lord Liverpool, who was Prime Minister from 1812 to 1827, do we find her equal. And he was the last survivor of the undemocratic and largely self-enclosed world of 18th century politics. This achievement is all the more remarkable because Mrs Thatcher is an outsider. During the last 150 years, Britain has been governed by 4 Prime Ministers who can plausibly be labelled in that way. The first was Benjamin Disraeli, known to his contemporaries as an indebted novelist and Jewish adventurer with an unconventional taste in clothes, who was Conservative Prime Minister in 1868 and again from 1874 to 1880, and became the apple of Queen Victoria's ageing but regal eye. The second was David Lloyd George, a small-town Welsh attorney who supported the Afrikaners against the British during the Boer War, delighted in his reputation as the scourge of the aristocracy and the House of Lords, and yet became Prime Minister in 1916, when he led a grateful nation to victory in the First World War. The third was Ramsay MacDonald, an illegitimate Scotsman born in humble circumstances, who became Labour Prime Minister in 1924 and again in 1929, but ended his career despised and rejected by most of his erstwhile supporters. The fourth of these atypical interlopers is Mrs Thatcher herself. Unlike the other 3, her name alone is enough to explain why she is, in one significant respect, the most distant and disqualified outsider of them all. For she is a woman leading a party traditionally renowned for being conservative in its social, no less than in its political attitudes. And she is a woman governing a nation that has rarely been in the forefront of the struggle for female emancipation. Not surprisingly, the fact of Thatcher's gender has fascinated journalists and commentators. They liken her to Queen Elizabeth I or to Britannia. They talk about her regal style and royal presumption. They wonder whether she is an honouring man, tough, combative, determined and aggressive. They depict her as a kind of national nanny, always saying no to the slightest hint of waywardness and self-indulgence. Or they describe her as a good housekeeper, who has elevated the private virtues of thrift and prudence into a national policy. It's also worth taking a more historical look at Thatcher's long tenure of power. Is she herself the architect of her own success, Or has she, at least in part, been the beneficiary of much deeper and broader forces? Beyond any doubt, the recession of the late 1970s and 1980s was a global phenomenon and led to a widespread turn to the right, not just in Britain, but also in the United States, West Germany, Canada, Denmark and Norway. In all these countries, the desire to cut public spending, to balance the budget, and to allow market forces free play has become the stated objective of government policy. But once again, there is a broader perspective we should not lose sight of. In the past, economic recession in Britain has often led to divisions on the political left and to resurgence on the political right. In the economic downturn of the 1880s and 1890s, the Liberal Party fell apart over Irish Home Rule, and the Conservatives enjoyed nearly 20 years of uninterrupted ascendancy as a result. And during the depression of the interwar years, the opposition was split between Liberals and Labour, which once again enabled the Conservatives under Stanley Baldwin to become the governing party. The same can equally be said of the Thatcher years. And in a similar manner, the problems associated with her long tenure of office have also appeared before. Sir Robert Walpole was Prime Minister of England in all but name from 1722 to 1742. By his second decade of power, the greatest threat to his position came not from his Tory opponents, but from his own erstwhile supporters. Some were deeply embittered men whom he had kept permanently out of office. Others had been sacked or driven to resignation. And in the end, it was a coalition of such men who brought him down. Nor should we forget, in the longer perspective of history, that the Conservative Party has been subject to savage and severe splits, which have on at least two occasions seemed to contemporaries to threaten its very survival. The first came in 1846, when the party was broken asunder over the question of whether to repeal the Corn Laws. Peel and his followers said yes, Disraeli and his friends said no. Peel got his way, at least in the short run. But he never held office again, and the Conservative Party was so weakened and divided that it was effectively out of power until 1874. The same sort of thing took place under Balfour in the early 1900s. Some members of the party were in favour of tariff reform, a scheme proposed by Joseph Chamberlain to institute imperial protection. Others wanted to cling to the old doctrine of free trade, which they believed had made Britain great in the past. The debate was long, divisive and acrimonious, and again the effect was shattering. The Conservative Party was vanquished in the general election of 1906, gave itself over to debilitating internecine battles which lasted until 1914, and did not hold real power again on their own until 1922. These are not encouraging precedents. Perhaps Europe will do the same to Mrs. Thatcher. Who knows? What is clear is that Europe, and Britain's relation with it, is an issue of equal, if not greater, importance. Some 30 years ago, a former American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, observed that Great Britain had lost an empire, but had not yet found a role in the world. That comment remains as true today as it did when it was first uttered. And the whole debate about Europe, on which Mrs. Thatcher's Tory party is so divided, is another sign that this issue is still unresolved. To see Mrs. Thatcher as an historical personality is neither to write her up nor to put her down. But this much at least seems certain. In the light of history, she is neither as novel nor as remarkable as her admirers believe or as her opponents fear. As Benjamin Disraeli once observed, and he after all had good cause to know, the vicissitudes of politics are inexhaustible. But however inexhaustible Mrs. Thatcher herself may be, those vicissitudes will undoubtedly outlive her.